Ethan, where are you? Ethan, can you hear me? Ethan! Nathan! Nathan! Nathan, where are you? Nathan! Nathan, are you hiding from me? Nathan, where are you? Nathan! Nathan, Nathan, come on! Nathan, please! Nathan.
Your son went over there.
The CEO's office?
Yes, you must hurry.
I'm going now. Nathan, what have you done?
5-year-old Nathan was sweeping the tiny floor of their one-room apartment when he suddenly stopped and looked up at his mother. Jane was rushing to put on her worn cleaning uniform before work. "Mommy," Nathan said quietly. Jane smiled without looking at him. "Yes, sweetheart?" Nathan hesitated for a moment before asking the question that always made her heart tighten. "Where is my dad?" Jane froze. For 5 years she had avoided that question because the truth was something she had buried deep in the past. A past that started with a dying mother, a drunken billionaire, and a night that changed her life forever. If you are new here, kindly click the subscribe button so that you can find us again. Now, let's go into the story. Nathan was only 5 years old, but anyone who saw him would think he had an old man's heart inside his small chest. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen and before the noise of the street began, the little room where he lived with his mother would already be awake. The room was small, with only one bed and a wooden chair that had lost one of its arms many years ago. That morning, Jane was rushing to prepare for work. She moved quickly, tying her scarf, looking for her cleaning uniform, and checking the small bag she carried to the big office where she worked. But while she was doing all that, Nathan was quietly busy in his own small way. First, he folded the blanket they both used at night. He folded it slowly and carefully, the way he had seen his mother do many times, pressing it down with his tiny hands as if the blanket might complain if he folded it wrongly. Then he carried a small broom, the kind made from dry palm sticks. The broom was almost as tall as him, but he held it proudly and swept one corner of the room, moving the dust little by little toward the door. After that, he went to where his mother's bag was lying on the chair. Inside the bag were the things Jane used for her cleaning work: gloves, a small towel, and a bottle of soap. Nathan took the gloves gently and arranged them neatly inside the bag, like a careful little man arranging tools for a journey. Jane stopped for a moment and watched him. At first she smiled, but the smile did not stay long. Something deep inside her chest began to ache. Pride was there, yes, but sadness was sitting beside it like an uninvited visitor. She walked closer and shook her head softly. "Nathan," her voice warm but worried, "you are too young to be doing all this." The boy lifted his shoulders in a small shrug, as if the work was nothing at all. "I'm helping my mommy," he said simply. Jane opened her mouth to speak again, but Nathan added another sentence, the kind that children say without knowing the weight of their own words. "Since Daddy is not here." Those words entered her heart like a quiet knife. For a moment, the room became very silent. Jane quickly turned her face away and pretended to look for something in her bag, because the tears had already filled her eyes, and she did not want her little boy to see them. And though Nathan didn't understand it yet, that simple sentence he had spoken that morning was the same question that would one day open the door to a secret Jane had buried deep in her past, a secret that was waiting patiently to return. Every morning, Jane would hold Nathan's small hand and walk him to the little daycare at the corner of the neighborhood. It was not a big place, just a small house with bright drawings on the wall and the laughter of children spilling out through the open windows. Nathan liked the place, but what he liked most was the short walk with his mother. As they walked, He would talk about many small things, about the bird he saw on the electric wire, about the dog that always slept beside the bread seller's shop, about the big cars that passed by and made the road shake. Jane would listen and nod, though her mind was often busy thinking about the long day of work waiting for her. When they reached the gate of the daycare, Nathan would suddenly become very serious, as if he was the one sending his mother to work instead of the other way around. Then he would wave his hand dramatically in the air, like a little chief sending his people on a journey. "Bye, Mommy," he would shout loudly so everyone could hear him. "Don't forget to eat lunch." The daycare teacher would laugh each time she heard him. She would shake her head and say, "This boy behaves like he's the parent and you are the child." Jane would smile when she heard that. The smile would sit on her face for a moment, warm and proud like the early morning sun. But as soon as she turned and began to walk away from the daycare gate, the smile would slowly fade. Her steps would grow heavier, and her face would change as if an invisible cloud had passed over it. Because deep in her heart, Jane knew something that the laughing teacher did not know, something that little Nathan himself did not yet understand. She knew that every step she took away from that daycare was the step of a woman carrying the weight of two parents on her shoulders. She knew she was raising that bright, curious boy alone in a world that could sometimes be hard and unforgiving. And though Nathan waved happily every morning, there was a question sleeping quietly inside his heart, a question about the father he had never seen. Jane did not know that one day that very question would rise like a storm and lead them both toward a past she had tried so hard to forget. That night, after the long noise of the street had finally grown quiet and the small room had settled into silence, Nathan was already fast asleep on the bed. His little chest rose and fell gently, the way a peaceful child sleeps after a long day of running and asking questions. Jane sat beside the window, the same old window whose curtain moved slowly whenever the night breeze passed through. Outside, the moon hung quietly in the dark sky, and the distant sound of a motorcycle faded somewhere down the road. Jane folded her arms around herself and stared into the night, but her eyes were not really seeing the street outside. Her mind had already traveled far away, walking slowly back into the past she had tried many times to forget. It carried her back to the night that changed everything. She remembered her mother first, Madame Elena lying weak on that thin mattress, her breathing slow and tired, her eyes looking at Jane with the kind of love that only a mother can carry. Jane could still hear her mother's faint voice calling her name. Then the memory moved forward like a restless wind. The city lights, the loud music, the club that smelled of alcohol and perfume, the glass of drink placed before her, the second one, the third, the room spinning around her like a storm, and then the man, the wealthy stranger with tired eyes and the smell of expensive cologne, the man whose life was so far from hers that their worlds should never have touched. Yet, that night, they did. Jane's fingers tightened slowly as she remembered the morning after, the large bundle of money lying on the table like a silent insult, and beside it, the small note written in careless handwriting, "Take this and disappear." Even after all these years, the words still burned in her chest like fresh fire. Jane lowered her head and closed her eyes, the shame of that memory still heavy in her heart. The money she had taken with trembling hands, the desperate hope that it would save her mother, and the cruel moment she returned home only to find death waiting quietly in the room where her mother once breathed. Jane swallowed slowly and whispered into the silent night, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the wind. "That night bought my mother's coffin and gave me my son." For a long moment, she sat there listening to Nathan's gentle breathing behind her. The boy slept peacefully, not knowing the strange path that had brought him into this world. But somewhere, deep inside Jane's heart, a quiet fear stirred again. Because the past, like an old story told by the elders, never truly disappears. It waits patiently in the shadows until the day it decides to return. The night Nathan was born was a quiet night. Jane lay weak on the narrow bed, her body tired from the long hours of pain. But in her arms was a tiny life wrapped in a thin cloth. The baby's skin was warm, his little fingers opening and closing slowly, as if he was already trying to hold on to the world he had just entered. Jane looked down at him for a long time without speaking. Her eyes were full of tears, but not the kind that come only from sadness. They were the tears of a young woman who had walked through shame, loss, and loneliness, yet had somehow arrived at this quiet moment with a child in her arms. Outside the window, a distant dog barked, and somewhere a car passed slowly on the road. But inside that small room, it felt as if time itself had stopped to watch them. Jane gently touched the baby's cheek with her finger, afraid that if she held him too tightly, he might disappear like a dream. In that moment, many thoughts passed through her mind like shadows moving across a wall. She remembered the night that had led to this child, the pain of losing her mother, the long journey that had brought her here alone. For a brief second, fear tried to rise in her heart, whispering that the road ahead would be hard, that people might judge her, that the world might not be kind to a woman raising a child without a father. But Jane pushed that fear away. She bent her head close to the baby and spoke in a quiet voice meant only for him to hear. "You will never feel unwanted." Her words were soft but strong, like a promise carved deep inside her heart. The baby moved slightly in her arms, making a small sound as if he had heard her and accepted the promise. Jane held him closer and continued to whisper, her voice trembling but determined. Even if she had to struggle every single day of her life, even if the world forced her to wake before sunrise and return home after sunset, even if she had to clean floors in buildings where people did not even know her name, she would do it without complaint. Because from that night forward, her life no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to the small boy sleeping peacefully in her arms. And though Jane did not know it yet, the promise she made in that quiet hospital room would one day lead them both into a future neither of them could imagine. A future where the past she had buried would slowly rise again, like an old story returning to be told. From that day forward, Jane's life slowly turned into the kind of life many mothers know, but few truly see. It became a life of quiet struggle, the kind that begins before the sun wakes up and ends long after the world has gone to sleep. Every morning, when the sky was still pale and the streets were not yet busy, Jane would already be awake. She would light the small stove, warm some water, and prepare Nathan for the day. Sometimes the boy would sit on the bed, rubbing his sleepy eyes while watching her move around the room. "Mommy, why do you wake up when it is still dark?" he once asked in his soft morning voice. Jane smiled while tying the lace of his small shoe. "Because the early bird must work hard before the sun becomes hot," she replied gently. Nathan thought about that and nodded, as if he had learned an important secret about life. After taking him to daycare, Jane would hurry to the tall office building where she worked. All day long, she cleaned places many people passed through without noticing. She wiped office desks that belonged to men and women who spoke loudly about business deals. She scrubbed bathroom floors until her hands smelled of soap and chemicals. She pushed her cleaning cart slowly through long hallways that echoed with the sound of footsteps and elevator bells. Sometimes workers passed by her without even looking at her face, but Jane never complained. In her heart, she always whispered the same words, "For Nathan. Everything is for Nathan." When evening came and the sun began to sink behind the buildings, Jane would return home tired, her legs heavy from standing all day. But her work was not finished yet. She would cook their small dinner, wash the clothes in a plastic basin, and sit beside Nathan to help him practice the letters he was learning at school. Nathan would hold his pencil tightly and look up at her with serious eyes. "Mommy, is this A correct?" he would ask. Jane would lean closer and smile. "Yes, my son, that is a strong A. One day you will write many strong words." Sometimes Nathan would laugh and say proudly, "When I grow up, I will write letters for you so you don't have to work too hard." Jane would laugh softly at that, but inside her heart, something warm would grow. Yet there were nights when the tiredness became too heavy for her body. On those nights, after Nathan had finished his schoolwork and gone to lie on the bed, Jane would sit on the chair for just a moment to rest, but that small moment would quietly turn into sleep. One night, Nathan woke up and looked around the dim room. The lamp was still on, and his mother was sitting on the chair with her head leaning to one side, fast asleep, the book she had been holding slipping slowly from her hand. Nathan climbed down from the bed quietly and walked toward her. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at her tired face the way a child studies something precious. Then he picked up the thin blanket from the bed and carefully placed it around her shoulders. His small hands tried to adjust it the way she always did for him. "Mommy works too hard," he whispered softly, thinking she could not hear him. Then he returned to the bed and lay down again. But what Nathan did not know was that Jane had opened her eyes just a little when she felt the blanket touch her shoulders. She did not move or speak. She simply watched her son climb back to the bed, and in that quiet moment, her heart became both heavy and strong at the same time. Because somewhere deep inside her, she knew that the little boy she was struggling so hard to raise would one day ask questions she could no longer avoid. Questions about the father he had never seen. Questions that might one day bring the past she had hidden back into their lives. As the seasons passed and Nathan grew a little taller, the quiet questions in his heart also began to grow. Children are like young birds. The more they see of the world, the more they begin to wonder about the things missing from their own nest. Nathan was no different. At school, he saw other children running into their father's arms when the day ended. Sometimes they heard them say, "My dad bought this for me," or "My dad will take me there." Nathan never complained, but those words stayed in his mind like small seeds waiting for the right moment to grow. One evening, after dinner, the small room was peaceful. Jane sat beside the bed helping Nathan trace letters in his small exercise book. The lamp on the table gave a soft yellow light, and outside the window the distant voices of neighbors floated through the night air. Nathan stopped writing and stared at the letter he had just drawn. Then he looked up at his mother with the serious eyes children sometimes have when they are about to ask something important. "Mommy," he began quietly. Jane looked at him and smiled. "Yes, my son." Nathan hesitated for a moment, as if arranging his thoughts the way he arranged his toys. Then he asked, "Mommy, do other children have dads?" The question entered the room so gently that for a moment it almost sounded harmless. Jane's hand paused on the page. Inside her chest, her heart beat once, slow and heavy, but she kept her voice calm. "Yes," she answered carefully. Nathan nodded slowly, thinking deeply about her answer. The room became quiet again for a moment, the kind of silence that feels like the air itself is waiting for something. Then Nathan asked the question that Jane had feared would one day come. "Then where is mine?" Jane looked at her son, and for a brief second, words refused to come to her mouth. Many thoughts rushed through her mind like a sudden storm. The memory of the past, the man she had not seen for years, the truth she had hidden like a secret buried in the earth. She forced a small smile and placed her hand gently on Nathan's shoulder. "Sometimes," she said slowly, choosing each word like a careful traveler choosing where to step, "life gives people different paths." Nathan listened closely, but his young mind could not fully understand the weight of those words. He looked down at his little hands resting on the book, then looked back at his mother again. For a moment, he was quiet, as if trying to solve a puzzle bigger than his age. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said in a soft voice. Jane felt a small relief in her chest, thinking the conversation might end there. But Nathan suddenly reached out and held her hand with surprising gentleness. Then he said something that struck her heart like a quiet thunder in the night. "It's okay," he told her. "I will take care of you." Jane felt her breath catch in her throat. The words of a child carried the weight of a grown man's promise. She quickly turned her face slightly away, pretending to look at the book again, because tears had already begun to gather in her eyes. Nathan did not see them. He simply leaned his head against her arm like a small boy who believed the world was simple. But deep inside Jane's heart, a silent fear stirred again, because she knew a day would come when Nathan would no longer accept quiet answers and gentle explanations. One day, he would want the full truth about the father he had never known, and when that day arrived, the past she had buried so carefully might rise again like an old story that refuses to remain untold. One morning, the sun had barely risen, and the street was still quiet, when Nathan tugged at Jane's sleeve with both small hands. His eyes were wide, serious, and full of the kind of curiosity that sometimes makes a mother's heart ache. "Mommy," he said, his voice small but firm, "I want to see where you work." Jane stopped what she was doing and looked down at him. Her heart tightened. The thought of bringing him to the big building, with all its noise, strangers, and strange smells, made her hesitate. "Nathan," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "it is not a place for little boys. It is work. It can be very tiring and busy." But Nathan would not be satisfied with that answer. He stepped closer, holding her hand tightly. "Please, Mommy, I just want to see. I promise I will be quiet. I will not touch anything. I will stay right by you." Jane shook her head and sighed. "No, Nathan, it is not safe. You have school, you have friends. Why do you need to see where I clean?" Nathan tilted his head, thinking, then whispered in a voice small but determined, "I want to know, Mommy. I want to see what you do to take care of me." Jane's heart wrenched at the words. She looked at him, his little face so serious, and for a moment she imagined him growing up with questions that she might not always be able to answer. The next morning Nathan asked again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each morning he waited, small hands clasped together, eyes fixed on her as if silently saying, "Please, Mommy." Finally, Jane's resolve cracked. She knelt down and looked into his earnest eyes. "All right, Nathan," she said softly. "You may come with me, but you must sit quietly, you must not touch anything or disturb anyone." Nathan's eyes lit up, and he nodded with the seriousness of a boy who understood that some rules must be obeyed. "I will be very responsible, Mommy," he promised, his voice steady and confident. Jane held his small hands for a moment longer, feeling both pride and worry. She did not know that this little visit, simple as it seemed, would one day uncover truths she had buried deep in the past, truths that even she was not ready to face. The building where Jane worked was like a small city all on its own, tall and shining in the morning sun, its windows glinting like thousands of little eyes watching the street below. Nathan's small mouth fell open, and his eyes grew round as saucers. "Wow!" he whispered, barely able to contain his wonder. "Do you clean all of this?" Jane laughed softly, the sound carrying a mix of pride and amusement. "I wish, my son," she said, ruffling his hair gently. "I only clean a small part, just enough to earn our bread." Nathan looked around again, his little head turning this way and that, taking in the long hallways, the shiny floors, and the busy elevators that carried people up and down like birds in a tall tree. Jane held his hand and led him to a small room tucked away behind the offices, a quiet place where the cleaning staff could rest. "Stay here," she said, giving him a small smile, "and don't go wandering off. This is where we keep our things and take a short rest." Nathan nodded seriously, his eyes following her every move as she went to her work. For a moment he sat quietly on the small chair, his tiny hands folded in his lap, pretending to obey. But soon his curiosity began to stir. Little fingers itched to touch the shiny buttons on the cart, to peek through the half-open doors, to follow the smells and sounds that floated through the hallways. His eyes sparkled with questions that had no words yet, and a quiet energy hummed inside him, urging him to explore. And so, despite his promise, Nathan rose silently from the chair, stepping into the wide hall, unaware that the building held secrets, and this small step of curiosity was about to bring him closer to truths his mother had long tried to keep hidden. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every footstep sound louder than it should. Nathan walked slowly, his small shoes tapping softly against the polished floor, his eyes wide with wonder and curiosity. He held his mother's small warning in his heart, "Stay here, don't wander." But the halls seemed to stretch endlessly, whispering secrets to him he could not resist. As he turned a corner, he noticed a large office door slightly open, light spilling softly from inside. He paused for a moment, looking up at the tall, imposing space, then took a deep breath and walked boldly in. Inside, a man sat behind a large desk, papers spread before him, the kind of man who seemed far older and heavier than his years, yet his eyes were alert. He looked up as Nathan entered. "Hello," he said, surprised but gentle. Nathan studied him carefully, tilting his head as if weighing each feature, each line on the man's face. "You look tired," the boy said quietly, in a voice small but firm. Mark's eyebrows rose, and then a low chuckle escaped him. "That's what happens when you work too much," he replied, amused and curious at the tiny observer in his office. Nathan didn't answer, but walked closer, his small steps careful yet fearless. "You should sleep," he said simply, his eyes steady on the man, as if giving advice meant for someone older. Mark laughed again, soft and warm, the sound echoing strangely in the large room. And then Nathan's eyelids grew heavy, and slowly, almost without notice, he fell asleep, his head finding its way to rest gently on Mark's lap. For some reason, a strange stillness settled in the room. Mark did not move, did not disturb the small child who lay sleeping so peacefully. Something about the calm innocence, the weight of the child's trust, and the quiet wisdom in his tiny voice held him in place. The office was no longer just a place of work. It had become a space where the past, the present, and a secret yet to be uncovered began to meet, whispering promises and questions that neither man nor child could yet fully understand. Jane finished her work slowly, her arms aching from scrubbing floors and moving heavy buckets, her uniform damp with sweat. She wiped her hands on her apron and took a deep breath, thinking of Nathan waiting quietly in the break room. The hallways were empty now, the offices silent, and the faint hum of the air conditioners filled the space like a low whisper. She walked quickly toward the small room where she had left him, imagining him sitting patiently on the chair, perhaps drawing with a crayon or fidgeting with his little hands. But when she opened the door, the room was empty. Her heart stopped for a long, heavy beat, as if the silence itself had reached inside her and squeezed. "Nathan?" she called softly, her voice trembling. No answer came, only the echo of her own words bouncing back at her. Panic rose like fire inside her. She ran to the hall, calling again, "Nathan, where are you?" Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind racing with every terrible thought she had ever held in the dark. She looked into the storage room, behind the carts, under the chairs, her hands shaking. "Nathan, please don't hide, don't run," she whispered, her voice barely holding itself together. The quiet building suddenly seemed endless, its corners hiding shadows that were not meant for a child. She ran to the elevators, the stairwells, every hallway, calling his name with the fear that made her voice rough. "Nathan, my son, where are you?" Each unanswered call made her chest ache more, the panic twisting her stomach into knots. For the first time in years, Jane felt truly helpless, knowing that this small boy she loved more than her own life had wandered beyond her reach, and that in this vast building something unknown was waiting, something that could change everything. Finally, a call cried out from down the hall, soft but firm. "Ma'am, I think your child went that way, the CEO's office." Jane's heart skipped a beat. She ran, her feet silent but hurried, her breath quick. When she reached the large door, she paused. Slowly, almost trembling, she pushed it open and stepped inside. Her eyes fell immediately on a sight that made her blood run cold. There, on the plush couch in the center of the office, was Nathan, asleep, his small head resting on a man's lap. And the man? Jane's eyes widened, her chest tightening like a drum being squeezed too hard. It was him, Mark Lawson, the man from that night she had buried deep in her memory. The air around her seemed to stop, heavy with the weight of the past. Mark looked up, and in that instant their eyes met. Time shifted, the years folding over them like the turning of a page. The past returned with a rush of wind, sharp and undeniable. He saw the recognition in her eyes and understood without a word. Calmly, with a hand steady as stone, he lifted Nathan from his lap and handed him to Jane. "You should be careful where your child wanders," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of authority and something else, something she could not name. Jane nodded silently, gripping Nathan close, her small hands clutching him as if he were the last thing keeping her tethered to the world. She turned and left the office without a word, her steps slow, measured, yet her body shook all over. Inside, fear, anger, relief, and memories she thought she had buried all surged together, twisting and turning like a storm. And Nathan slept peacefully in her arms, unaware that the quiet moment revealed a shadow of the past that would not let go so easily. That night, Jane lay on her narrow bed, but sleep would not come. The small room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the fan, yet her mind roared with a storm she could not calm. Seeing Mark again had opened a door she had tried so hard to lock. Memories rushed in like water breaking a dam. The shame of that night years ago, the pain of losing her mother, the note, the money, the helplessness, all pressed against her chest until it hurt to breathe. She turned Nathan gently in his sleep, brushing a stray curl from his forehead, and whispered softly, "Forgive me, my son, for the things you do not know yet." Her thoughts circled the encounter over and over, the way his calm voice, his eyes had held the past so close, so near to being uncovered. She could still feel the weight of his presence in the office, the quiet understanding that neither of them could name, yet both had felt. She pressed her face into her hands and whispered to herself, I cannot face this, not yet." Hours passed, the night thick around her, and when the first faint light of dawn touched the walls, she made her decision. She sat up, still trembling, and wrote quickly on a piece of paper, the words simple, clean, final. Her resignation, no explanations, no reasons. She folded the paper and left it on her desk, the pen still warm in her hand. That morning, she walked away from the building she had worked in for months, from the walls that had witnessed her struggle. She walked with Nathan, holding him close, feeling the weight of the past and the fear of the future pressing against her like a shadow. She disappeared from the job quietly, leaving only the small echo of her footsteps behind. A woman running not from work, but from a past that had finally found its way back to her door. Mark could not forget the boy. Even in the midst of meetings, phones ringing, and papers shuffling, Nathan's small face floated in his mind, the way a bright star lingers in the night sky long after it has been seen. Something about the boy's eyes, so steady and serious, tugged at something deep inside him. They were not just the eyes of any child, they were familiar, as if they had been waiting for him to recognize them. And then the memory rushing back, sharp and sudden. The woman, Jane, the girl from years ago, the one night, the money, the note, the story he had never known. His hands trembled slightly as he sat at his desk, the office quiet around him. He could not shake the feeling that the boy in his office, sleeping so peacefully, was a part of a past he had buried without knowing it. Quietly, secretly, he ordered a DNA test, using the small strand of hair he had taken from Nathan's jacket earlier, careful that no one else would see, careful that the truth could come to light in its own time. Days passed like slow rivers, and then the result arrived. Mark held the paper in his hands, staring at the numbers printed so plainly. 99% probability. Nathan, his son. He felt the world tilt beneath him, the ground shifting as if all the years of silence and absence had been waiting to collapse into this moment. Mark sat silently for a long time, the office empty and still around him, the hum of the air conditioner like the quiet heartbeat of a story just beginning. He did not speak, did not move, because the truth was heavy, deep, and sudden, and it demanded silence first. And in that silence, he began to imagine the boy's small hands, his serious eyes, and the mother he had once met, and a question whispered softly in his heart. How could he step into their lives without breaking the delicate balance they had survived so far? Mark began searching quietly, carefully, moving through the city like a shadow. He asked no one directly about the small boy, but his eyes missed nothing. Children playing in the street, mothers walking with little ones, streets, shops, every corner he thought Nathan might appear. But Jane, she had vanished. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole, leaving only whispers of the small life she carried with her. Weeks turned into months, and Mark's search grew heavier with each passing day. He watched the city change with the seasons, the rains falling hard on the streets, the sun baking the asphalt, and still he moved silently, searching, patient and relentless. Every lead ended in silence. Every glimpse of a small boy brought hope, then disappointment, as he realized it was not Nathan. And yet he could not stop. He could not forget the boy's eyes, the way Nathan had spoken to him as if he had known him all his life. Finally, after months of wandering, his persistence bore fruit. A friend mentioned a school tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, a small building surrounded by flowering bushes and laughter spilling from the gates. Mark's heart tightened. Could this be it? Could Nathan really be here? He went to the school, lingering at the edge of the gate, hidden behind a tree, waiting. Day after day he sat there, silent and unseen, watching the children play, the mothers chatter, the teachers calling out names. He did not approach, did not call, because he knew that the balance of their lives was delicate and he had no right to rush it. He watched the sun rise and fall, the shadows growing long across the yard, until one afternoon the gates opened and Jane appeared. She walked slowly, holding Nathan's small hand in hers, her face calm but tired, her eyes scanning the yard for other mothers and small children. Nathan skipped ahead slightly, chattering about a game he had made up, laughing at his own words. Mark's chest tightened so suddenly he felt as if he could not breathe. There she was, the mother of his child, the woman whose memory had haunted him since that night, moving quietly, unaware that he waited, unseen, at the edge of the schoolyard. He did not move, did not call. He simply watched, the weight of the months of searching pressing on him, and yet in that silence a quiet hope began to stir. Because today, he thought, today he would finally see them both again, the child and the mother, and perhaps begin to understand how to enter the life they had built without breaking it. Mark stepped slowly forward, careful not to startle them. His hands were empty, his face calm, the city noise fading behind him like it did not matter. Jane's head snapped up the moment she sensed him, her small frame stiffening instantly, a shield forming around her and Nathan. "I don't want anything from you," she said quickly, her voice sharp but low, a warning more than a question. Mark shook his head gently, his eyes steady on hers, full of something she could not name yet. "I'm not here for money," he said softly, the words deliberate and calm. Jane's breath caught, but she did not lower her guard. He glanced at Nathan, who was looking at him curiously, unaware of the tension in his mother's body. Mark knelt down slowly to be at the boy's level, careful to keep his hands opened and harmless. "Hello again, young man," he said, his voice soft, carrying no command, no expectation, only a quiet recognition. Nathan's small face brightened with a smile, as if he already remembered a story he did not know the ending to. Jane's eyes never left him, sharp and wary, but a part of her could not help the tiny flutter in her chest at seeing Nathan respond so freely. Mark then stood a little straighter, his gaze returning to Jane. His voice lowered, steady but insistent. "We need to talk," he said simply. Jane swallowed, her hands tightening around Nathan's, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on her again. She did not answer immediately, her eyes scanning him for lies, for threats, for anything that might undo the careful life she had built. But inside, her heart pounded like the drums of an old story, a rhythm she could not ignore. The silence stretched between them, thick with all that had been left unsaid, and yet charged with the possibility that today, everything might finally begin to change. They walked slowly through the quiet park, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, but softened by the leaves of the tall trees that lined the winding paths. Nathan ran ahead a little, chasing a stray butterfly that flitted from flower to flower, laughing and calling over his shoulder, "Mommy, come see! Look!" Jane smiled faintly, but her hands trembled slightly as she held Mark's arm at her side, guiding him without really holding him. When they reached a worn wooden bench tucked beneath an old mango tree, Mark lowered himself carefully onto the seat, his eyes soft but attentive, and Jane sat beside him, Nathan's small hand slipping into hers for comfort. For a long moment they did not speak. The only sounds were the quiet rustle of the leaves and the distant voices of children playing. Then Jane took a deep breath, a tremor in her chest, and began quietly. It all started with my mother," she said, her voice low, carrying the weight of years she had held alone. "Madame Elena. She was sick for a long time. I had no one to help her. I tried everything. I begged, I prayed, but the money, there was never enough." She paused, looking down at her hands folded tightly in her lap, and the words came out more sharply than she intended. "And then, Joy, my friend, she told me about the club. She said maybe I could find someone willing to help." Mark listened silently, the expression on his face unreadable, but his eyes never left hers. Jane's fingers tightened around her own palms, and her voice shook slightly as she continued. I went. I drank. I didn't know what I was doing. I met him." Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard, the words almost catching in her chest. "The billionaire. You. That night, I was drunk. I lost my virginity. And the next morning, the money was there, a bundle and a note. 'Take this and disappear.' That's all it said. My mother, she died that morning. I had the money. I should have saved her, but it was too late. Too late for her, too late for me." Her voice faltered, and she closed her eyes, the memory stabbing her heart like a knife. I buried her quietly, alone. And then Nathan came. She looked out at the boy playing a little distance away, his laughter spilling through the warm air, and her lips trembled. I raised him alone. I had nothing. I started a small shop. It was hope. A little hope for us. But the government, they came and marked it for demolition. I was still recovering from giving birth, and everything I had worked for, gone. So I started cleaning. Long hours, nights without rest, learning letters with him, cooking, washing, surviving. And the reason I resigned from your office, I couldn't face you. Seeing you, it reopened everything. The shame, the pain, the memory of that night. I could not look at you and know that my life, that Nathan's life, started because of you, unknowingly, in a way, that I could not forgive. Not yet." She stopped, her chest heaving slightly, her voice almost a whisper at the end. Mark remained silent for a long time, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes you feel the weight of truth settling between you. His eyes followed Nathan, running and laughing, chasing shadows and sunbeams. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost trembling with something Jane could not name. "You should have told me." Jane laughed bitterly, the sound cutting like dry wind. "Told you what?" she said, her words sharp but sad. "That I was the girl you paid to disappear?" Mark's gaze stayed fixed on Nathan, small and alive, running ahead of them, his laughter filling the air. His voice softened, almost tender, almost afraid of disturbing the moment. "He's my son," he said quietly. Jane's heart froze, a tremor running through her body. She looked at him, the words catching in her throat. For a long moment, neither moved. The world seemed to pause around them, the leaves still, the children's voices faint, the warm sun pressing down gently. And Jane felt all the years, all the pain, all the solitude of raising Nathan alone, pressing against her chest like a weight she had carried for too long. And yet, as she looked at the man before her, the boy laughing a little way off, and the truth finally spoken between them, something fragile, something impossible began to grow. It was fear, yes. It was anger, yes. But it was also the first flicker of hope, the first breath of a story that had waited years to be told, waiting for the moment when it could begin to heal instead of hurt. Later that evening, the sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink, the sun lowering itself behind the distant buildings, turning the city into a quiet, gentle place that felt almost like a village at peace. Nathan sat on the edge of the small wooden bench, picking at the grass, his little hands busy but his mind clearly turning over questions that had been growing in him like tiny seeds, waiting for the right moment to bloom. He looked up at Jane with his wide, serious eyes, the kind of eyes that a mother's heart ache with both pride and fear. "Mommy?" he began hesitantly, twisting his small fingers together. "Who is that man?" Jane's chest tightened so suddenly that it hurt to breathe. She knelt beside him carefully, lowering herself to meet his gaze, trying to steady her voice though it quivered just slightly. "That is your father," she said softly, her words deliberate, carrying the weight of years she had held alone, of secrets that had pressed on her heart like heavy stones. Nathan blinked slowly, processing the words, the way a child might take a long sip from a cup filled with something strong and strange, unsure what it tasted like but knowing it mattered. His eyes widened, and he turned them carefully toward Mark, who was standing a few steps away, tall and still, watching quietly, his own heart caught in a strange and unfamiliar rhythm. Nathan studied him carefully, tilting his head, observing the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the way he seemed calm yet aware of every movement in the park, the boy feeling something he did not yet have words for. After a long moment, his small lips parted, and the most innocent question he had ever asked in his life came out, slow and tentative, but carrying a weight far beyond his years. "Are you staying or going far away again?" Jane's hand tightened lightly around his small shoulder, the pulse of her heart echoing in her ears, and she looked up at Mark, silent, waiting for his answer, knowing that the boy's world, their world, could shift in a single word. Mark took a deep breath, a quiet one, and his voice came out soft, almost trembling yet steady with promise. "I'm staying," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of everything he had felt for months, the searching, the longing, the guilt, the love he had not known he could feel until he saw the small boy sleeping on his lap, until he heard Jane's story in full. Nathan's eyes lit up, bright and round, as if the world had suddenly opened wide before him. Without hesitation, without thinking of the careful steps his small body had been taught, he ran toward Mark, arms flailing with unrestrained joy and relief, a laugh bubbling from his lips like water over stones. Mark knelt quickly to catch him, his strong arms lifting the small, trembling boy into a careful embrace. Nathan buried his head against his father's chest, his tiny hands gripping the front of Mark's shirt as if holding on to something he had always known was missing, yet never had until this moment. Jane watched them from the side, kneeling still, her own hands pressed together tightly, tears pricking her eyes as she saw the years of solitude and struggle dissolve in the warmth of that embrace. Mark held Nathan close, whispering softly, "It's okay, little one. I'm here. I won't leave again." Nathan pulled back just enough to look into Mark's eyes, his small face serious but shining with trust, and said quietly, "I knew you would come back. I just had to wait." Mark's chest tightened, his own tears threatening, but he nodded solemnly. "Yes, I am here, and I will stay." Jane leaned closer, resting a hand on Nathan's small shoulder, her voice trembling but steady. "You see, my son? The man before you is your father. He is not leaving. Not now." Nathan smiled then, the kind of smile that held both innocence and a surprising understanding, and he wrapped his arms tighter around Mark's neck, pressing his small face into the warmth he had longed for without knowing it. Mark whispered again, gently, "I promise, Nathan, I will never go away again. We will be together now." And in that quiet park, under the branches of the old mango tree, with the sun painting long golden shadows across the grass, mother, father, and child sat together, three hearts slowly learning to beat as one, the past and the pain mingling with hope, and the long, winding story of their lives beginning anew, tender, fragile, yet filled with the promise that some stories, no matter how broken or heavy, can find their way back to light. Months later, the world seemed to have softened around them, as if the long years of struggle, of secrets, of fear and longing had slowly eased into something quieter, gentler, though not without scars. The garden behind the house was alive with the bright green of freshly watered grass, the colors of flowers spilling like painted drops across the borders, the sun warm and soft on the earth. Nathan ran through it like a small whirlwind, his laughter ringing clear and strong, echoing off the walls of the small courtyard, chasing itself over the flowers and winding paths. Jane stood nearby, leaning lightly against the wooden railing, a cup of tea warm between her hands. She watched him, her eyes soft, her chest filled with the quiet ache of both pride and relief. He had grown in these months, small but sturdy, curious and bright, carrying a spark in him that reminded her painfully of the nights she had spent alone, worrying and hoping, wondering if she had done enough, if she could do enough. Mark stood beside her, tall and calm, one hand resting gently against the railing, his other hand relaxed at his side, his eyes following Nathan with a quiet intensity that Jane could not ignore. "He always wanted to know where his father was," Jane said softly, her voice low, more a whisper to herself than to Mark, the steam of her tea rising like a small, fragile smoke between them. Mark smiled then, not a wide smile, not a triumph, but a quiet one, full of something like understanding and something more, something that had grown in the months since he had stepped carefully into their lives. "And now?" he asked gently, the words carrying both question and promise. Jane sipped her tea slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest, and watched Nathan as he ran in wide circles, arms outstretched, laughing as if the world were only this garden, only this sun, only this moment. He skidded to a stop near them, dusting at his knees, his small chest heaving from the run, eyes bright and shining, and he turned toward Mark with a grin that was all innocence and recognition, the kind of grin that belongs only to children who have found the pieces they were missing. Now he knows, Jane said softly, almost to herself, her eyes tracing the lines of Nathan's small face, the joy that had blossomed there, the relief, the comfort of a child who had waited long enough and finally found what he was looking for. Mark's hand moved slowly, gently, brushing Nathan's hair from his forehead, and the boy leaned into it without hesitation, trusting, complete. Jane watched the two of them, her chest tight, her lips trembling, and whispered quietly, more to the garden, more to the wind. "All those years, all that fear, it has brought us here." Mark looked at her, his eyes catching the sunlight, and nodded slightly, the silent understanding between them as heavy as it was gentle. "We are here," he said softly, "together now." Nathan ran another circle through the garden, stopping only to throw himself into Mark's arms, laughing, shouting, full of life and love. And Jane watched, her tears glinting in her eyes, her tea forgotten in her hands. "He always needed to know," she murmured, her voice breaking just slightly. Mark tightened his hold on Nathan, then looked at Jane, his expression soft, careful, full of a quiet promise. "And now he will never be without us again," he said, and Jane nodded, feeling the weight of every lonely night, every struggle, every tear lifting slightly from her shoulders. They stood together then, the three of them, under the sun, the garden alive around them, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze, and the world outside felt distant, unimportant. Nathan laughed again, chasing a butterfly that had wandered too close to the hedge, and Jane watched him, her heart swelling, knowing that the boy who always asked, who always wondered, who always hoped, now had both the answers and the love he deserved. And Mark stood beside her, steady, patient, a quiet strength that promised to be there, not for a moment, but for all the moments that would follow. And Jane let herself breathe, finally, fully, as the laughter of her son rang out across the garden, pure and unbroken, carrying the past, the pain, and the promise of a future they would walk together, slowly, gently, hand in hand, heart to heart. The snow was falling softly over the city that night, the kind of quiet snowfall that made the streets of London look calm and gentle, even when hearts inside the buildings were beating with fear and urgency. Jane held her stomach tightly as another wave of pain moved through her body, strong and sudden like a storm rising from deep waters. She leaned against the cold brick wall outside the hospital entrance, breathing hard, her breath rising into the winter air like small clouds. Mark stood beside her, his dark coat dusted with snow, his scarf hanging loosely around his neck. His hands trembled slightly as he held her arm, trying to steady her as the pain gripped her again. "Jane, breathe," he said softly, though his own voice carried worry. Jane squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head slightly, her voice weak but determined. I am trying." Another contraction came, stronger this time, and she bent forward, gripping his hand tightly. Mark looked toward the hospital doors just a few steps away, the bright lights glowing through the glass. "We're almost there," he whispered, his voice full of urgency and tenderness. He guided her carefully forward, step by step, through the falling snow and into the warm light of the hospital entrance. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them immediately, but Jane barely noticed it. The pain had become stronger now, rising and falling like powerful waves in a restless sea. A nurse hurried toward them when she saw Jane's condition. "She's in labor," Mark said quickly, his voice tense. The nurse nodded and quickly brought a wheelchair, helping Jane sit down gently as another contraction passed through her body. Jane gripped the arms of the chair tightly, her breathing uneven. Mark walked beside her as they moved quickly down the hospital corridor, the wheels of the chair rolling across the polished floor. The hallway lights glowed softly above them, and the sound of distant voices and machines filled the air. Jane felt as if the world had narrowed to one thing only, the life inside her that was ready to enter the world. They reached the delivery room, and the nurses helped Jane onto the hospital bed. Her hair clung slightly to her forehead, and her hands shook as she tried to steady herself. Mark stood beside her, unsure of where to place himself in the room filled with nurses and quiet instructions. But when Jane reached out blindly, searching for something to hold on to, he immediately stepped forward and placed his hand in hers. She gripped it tightly, as if it were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The doctor entered calmly, his voice steady as he spoke to the nurses. The room filled with quiet movement, gloves snapping into place, machines humming softly, instruments arranged carefully on trays. Jane's breathing grew heavier as another contraction came, stronger than before. She squeezed Mark's hands so tightly that he winced slightly, but he did not pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice low and gentle near her ear. "You are strong, Jane," he said softly. "You can do this." Jane shook her head weakly, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "It hurts," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark's grip tightened slightly, his thumb gently brushing against the back of her hand. "I know," he said quietly, "but you are not alone." The doctor nodded slightly as he looked at the monitors. "It's time," he said calmly. Jane's body tensed as the next contraction came, powerful and overwhelming. She cried out softly, her head pressing back against the pillow as she gathered every bit of strength she had. Mark remained beside her, his hand still firmly in hers. "Push, Jane," the doctor instructed. Jane took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling quickly. She pushed with everything she had, her face tightening with effort and pain. Mark watched her with a mixture of fear and amazement, his heart beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. "You're doing well," the doctor said encouragingly. "Just a little more." Jane cried out again as another contraction surged through her. Her hand tightened around Mark's until his fingers turned pale beneath her grip, but he did not move. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're almost there, just a little more." Sweat glistened on Jane's forehead, and her breathing became quick and shallow as she gathered strength again. The room seemed to grow quiet, except for the sound of her breathing and the steady hum of the machines beside the bed. "Push," the doctor said again. Jane pushed with all the strength left in her body, her eyes squeezed shut as she cried out in pain and determination. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. And then, suddenly, the room was filled with a new sound. A small cry, sharp and clear, rose into the air. The doctor lifted the newborn baby gently, wrapping him in a soft hospital cloth as the tiny cry grew louder. Jane's body relaxed instantly against the bed, her chest rising and falling as tears slipped down her cheeks. Mark stood frozen beside her, his eyes wide as he stared at the tiny life now held in the doctor's hands. The doctor smiled softly as he turned toward them. "A healthy baby boy," he said. Jane covered her mouth with her free hand, overwhelmed by the sound of her child's first cry. The nurse gently placed the baby in her arms, wrapped carefully in the warm blanket. Jane looked down slowly, her eyes soft and shining with tears. The baby's tiny face moved slightly, his small hands curling against the blanket. Mark leaned closer, his eyes filled with quiet wonder as he looked at the child. Jane's voice was barely a whisper. "Amanda," she said softly. Mark looked at her, then at the baby again. "Amanda," he repeated quietly. Jane held the baby close to her chest, her exhaustion mixing with a deep warmth that spread through her heart. The snow continued to fall outside the hospital window, drifting slowly through the night as the city slept. Inside the quiet room, the small cry of the newborn faded into soft breathing. Mark gently reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger. Amanda's fingers curled around it instinctively. Mark's expression softened as he watched the child, the weight of the moment settling gently over him. Jane closed her eyes for a moment, holding her daughter close, the warmth of his small body against hers. The long night of pain had passed, and in its place now was something new, fragile, small, and full of life. And as the snow fell quietly outside the hospital window, the first moments of Amanda's life began in the quiet warmth of that small room, with her mother holding her close, and a man beside her who could not yet understand how deeply that tiny child one day would change his life forever.